It is Kieran Trippier. It is delicious! Glorious! Glorious!
Walker in there too. Luke Shaw! Harry Kane wants it played into him. He chooses Grealish instead. It's Grealish! It's Kane! I think like this has happened for a long time. Here's the overhead kick from Kane! Palmer finds Watkins. Watkins turns! Watkins scores!
Hello and welcome to the Gate 102 podcast. I hope I find you well. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode, which is our final episode of 2025. I can't believe we're at the end of the year already. Where has this year gone? But yes, today's episode, I actually won't be talking about a specific game, but instead I'll be talking about the squad that Southgate selected for the European Championships, which were held in 2021. Now, I've just talked about the two warm-up friendly games, which were both played at the Riverside Stadium against Austria and Romania. Both of them ended up 1-0 wins for England, so do check those out if you haven't already. And when the new year starts, I'll be talking about the actual tournament games, starting with Croatia and ending with Italy, both at Wembley, so very excited to be talking about another tournament again. But I thought I'd dedicate an episode going into detail about the squad, just like I did last time when it was the 2018 World Cup series. But one difference between the squad for this Euros compared to the squad picked back in 2018 was the amount of players you could pick. So most tournaments in the past before this one, it was a maximum of 23 players. But this time, it was announced by UEFA that up to 26 players could be selected. Now, this change was introduced to help teams cope with possible COVID cases that could be picked up during the tournament. So having those extra players was done deliberately to try and navigate that. So the benefit of this, it meant that Southgate could pick a slightly bigger squad, which I think helped because it gave England more options and it allowed Gareth to pick different profile of players. So I think before I delve into each player and position, I'll start by just naming the squad that was picked. So goalkeepers, it was Jordan Pickford, Sam Johnstone and Aaron Ramsdale. Now Aaron Ramsdale came in for Dean Henderson. Dean Henderson got injured, so Aaron Ramsdale, who's a standby, was selected as his replacement. Defenders, Kyle Walker, Kieran Trippier, Reece James, Luke Shaw, Ben Chilwell, John Stones, Harry Maguire, Connor Cody, Tyrone Mings, and Ben White. And again, Ben White was not originally called up, but he replaced Trent Alexander-Arnold after he was forced to withdraw. Moving on to the midfielders, it was Declan Rice, Calvin Phillips, Jordan Henderson, Jude Bellingham, and Mason Mount. And then moving on to the attacking options, you have Phil Foden, Raheem Sterling, Marcus Rashford, Jack Grealish, Jadon Sancho, Bukayo Saka, Dominic Calvert-Lewin, and of course the captain, Harry Kane. So there we are. They were the 26 players who went to the European Championships that summer. Other players on the standby list were people like Ben Godfrey, James Ward-Prowse, Jesse Lingard and Ollie Watkins. Unfortunately, for those four, they did not make the cut from the provisional squad. But to be honest, I don't think any of them four players were really needed. As much as they were good players at the time, England just had too much depth and better players in those areas of the pitch. Okay, so what I'll do, I'll give my thoughts and opinions on the squad. And I know it's strange because I know the outcome of the tournament, so I know what players played well, what worked, what didn't work. So it's easy for me to say all these years later what I thought of the squad at the time it was announced because, like I say, I know the outcome, but I'll try and cast my mind back to what I was thinking 4 and a bit years ago when I first saw the squad announced. So we'll start with position. So we'll start in the defensive areas. So we'll go with goalkeepers first. So let's look at the goalkeepers. Obviously, Jordan Pickford, it goes without saying, really. It was obvious that he was going to be England's number one for the second consecutive tournament. Obviously, he was exceptional throughout 2018. And even between the two tournaments as well, obviously came big against Switzerland in the Nations League. He was just so consistent every time he put on a shirt. He put on a shirt for England. So, nothing really to add to that other than obvious, really. Sam Johnstone was England's second choice that tournament. Now, he played for West Brom that season in the Prem. Now, West Brom, unfortunately, got relegated, but Southgate still showed faith in him and chose to pick him. And he made his debut in the game I just talked about recently against Romania. And he made an outstanding save second half to keep a clean sheet and help England get the win. So that was, he really did take his opportunity in the last game. Aaron Ramsdale was, as mentioned, a late call-up after Dean Henderson got injured. Now, he was first choice for Sheffield United that season, and he actually played every Premier League game, all 38. Now, Sheffield United also got relegated that season, just like West Brom. So essentially, Southgate's picked two Championship goalkeepers, essentially. Obviously, they were not Championship standard. They were definitely Premier League standard, but it's a shame about Henderson, as he played a few games for Man United that season. I think if he was fit, he would have been the natural number two and the natural deputy to Jordan Pickford. And then I think he probably goes one of Johnstone or Ramsdale as third choice. Okay, so moving on to defenders. Now, I think a lot of fans were a bit annoyed when the squad was originally announced that there were so many right-backs. But I didn't really understand the criticism about picking so many right-backs, because it wasn't really three right-backs. You had Trippier, who could play at left-back. You had Walker, who could play at centre-back. Reece James could play as a wing-back as well, and also in midfield. So there's quite a lot of versatility amongst those three players, and that was really important. But all three of those right-backs selected had brilliant seasons and all deserved to be there. Obviously, Walker just won the Premier League with Man City. Trippier had a great season with Atletico Madrid. Reece James had just won the Champions League with Chelsea under Thomas Tuchel. So England had a lot of depth and talent in many positions, but I think right-back was really one that stood out. And there was quite a lot of debate about who would start out of those three. Because, I mean, all three of them were amazing options. And in the end, all three of them played some part in the tournament. In terms of centre-backs, obviously John Stones and Harry Maguire get their places. And having that partnership be continued, I think, provided great balance and experience. And that was so significant in the success we had that summer. To have that solid foundation that those two provided was really important. But having said that, it is worth mentioning that Maguire was to miss the opening two games of the tournament because of injury that he picked up towards the end. And that meant it was an opportunity for one of the other centre-backs who was selected to play at the start of the tournament, them being Tyrone Mings, Connor Cody and Ben White. And obviously I talked a lot about Ben White in my last episode, so I won't go into too much detail about him. Obviously he could play right back, but at the time he was predominantly a centre-half. But Tyrone Mings was a solid option. He was left-footed as well, which probably gave him a slight advantage playing in that left-sided centre-back role. And he was a similar profile to Maguire in terms of his physicality, really strong, good in the air. He had a good season for Aston Villa in the Prem. So he definitely deserved to be there in the squad. Connor Cody also made sense, and I'm pleased he was selected because he was used to playing in a back three system. So if England were to change formation and switch to a back three, which was the case in the tournament, Cody was an option if you were to do that. Now, obviously, he didn't go on to play any minutes in that tournament, but I imagine he was an amazing character to have off the pitch. He was captain of Wolves at the time, so he had good leadership skills. He was vocal, a good communicator. And I remember back in that tournament, I used to watch like Lion's Den. I'm sure people remember it, and like videos of them training or on the unicorns, and you could just tell Cody just loved to be there. And I'm not saying that automatically gets you in the squad, but it must have been great just to have that character, and within the camp must have been really special. And he really embraced every moment he had with the squad from the outside, it looked like. So yeah, I was pleased Cody was selected, but in the end it was obviously Tyrone Mings who got the nod as Maguire's replacement in the first 2 games. But I'll talk more about that in future episodes. So moving on to left backs, we had Luke Shaw and Ben Chilwell, and both of them were really good options, and both players had impressed for both club and country throughout the season. Luke Shaw had been really good for Man United. Obviously, he had his injury issues before and after this tournament, but it was nice that he was fit and able to play during that summer. Ben Chilwell had really impressed during qualification, and he actually got 3 assists throughout the campaign in just 5 games for England, helping us qualify. So that was impressive. And he'd also won the Champions League with Chelsea. So England had 2 really good options at left back. Also Kieran Trippier as well. And he obviously started the first game of the tournament in that position. But this was good because if you cast your mind back to 2018 and the World Cup, you had Danny Rose and Ashley Young as our left-sided options. And both of them did a great job, by the way. I don't want to make any mistake about that. They were both really good in that tournament, but they were not at the same standard as the left-backs we had going into this tournament. So it was nice that we were seeing the development of the squad over time, and I'll talk more about that later on. So yeah, that's the defence. Moving on to midfield, and there were very few surprises really. Declan Rice was a nailed-on inclusion and a certainty to start the tournament, and he'd been absolutely pivotal for England throughout qualification, and his rise over the 2 years prior to this tournament starting had been remarkable. Obviously, he first broke into the side in early 2019, made his debut, I think it was Czech Republic at home. I think I'll have to double check. He was almost playing as a inverted centre-back, and then he quickly developed into a true holding midfielder, and that was a position England had little depth in. So by the time this European Championships came around, he was arguably one of England's most important players overall, and unquestionably the most crucial midfielder we had at the time. Calvin Phillips was also included. He had a fantastic season with Leeds in the Prem, and he really burst on the scene that year, and it was no surprise to see him named. And yeah, what a tournament it turned out to be for him. I mean, Southgate called Phillips up before he even played in the Prem, and that's how much he rated him, and that's how much he saw potential in Phillips. Even though he did not have that Premier League experience, Southgate still thought, you know what, I'm gonna call this lad up and see what he can do. And a year later, he's starting in the tournament. Jordan Henderson was also named. Now, this was a strange one because he'd had quite a stop-start season for Liverpool. And throughout the campaign, he was heavily disrupted by injury. It did sort of cast some doubt over his role heading into the Euros. And he suffered quite a bad groin injury in February that required surgery. And it ruled him out for nearly 3 months. And it limited to just 16 Premier League appearances that season, I think. So thankfully, he did return late on. but he was short of like match sharpness, which I think is why he started no games that tournament because he wasn't fully fit. But even though he wasn't coming into the tournament, match sharp, when you include Henderson in the squad, you get a lot of leadership, a lot of experience, and his importance to the changing room would have been essential. And that was something I think England missed in the Euros after this one in 2024. I think we actually missed Henderson's leadership, but thankfully he made it back in time for the summer of 2021. And he was another option that England had sort of defensively in midfield. Jude Bellingham's inclusion did raise quite a few eyebrows, mostly because of how young he was, but it did make a lot of sense. At just 17, he was already playing week in, week out for Dortmund, and looking so comfortable at that level. And Southgate clearly liked his energy and his maturity, and the fact that he could play multiple different positions in midfield was beneficial. And he was never going to be a key starter in that tournament, but taking Jude along was almost about recognising how good he already was and giving him that tournament experience early on. And also he had impressed in the games he'd played for England so far, so he was a good option to have in the squad. But it was just so exciting to see, Jude being selected at a young age, and it showed how much Southgate valued him. So moving slightly higher up the pitch in that number 10 position, and England were spoiled for choice, really. You had Mount, Grealish and Foden all competing for that same spot. And there was a lot of debate before the tournament about, who would Southgate play. Obviously, Foden and Grealish could play on the wing, but it always felt like one of those three was going to be the main option centrally. And the key thing is that all those three players had just come off excellent club seasons, and each one of them brought something slightly different. Obviously, Mason Mount gave you a lot of energy. He pressed relentlessly, worked hard off the ball, and he really linked the midfield and attack really well. In Foden, you had a technically brilliant player, really good in tight spaces, comfortable under pressure. And then Grealish, he offered something completely different again, a bit more direct, happy to take players on and win fouls. So, yeah, England had real strength and depth in that number 10 position. But when the tournament started, Southgate did lean towards Mason Mount. I think it made sense. He gave the team balance alongside Rice and Phillips. I think he fitted the system perfectly. And he'd been scoring and performing consistently in the build-up to the Euros. He scored against Albania. He scored the winning goal against Belgium at Wembley. And he was just in great form for both club and country. And he also won the Champions League that summer. So, yeah, he was in the form of his life at this point. So, yeah, I think it was the right decision to play Mount as that number 10. And Southgate clearly trusted Mount, which was clearly important. So moving on to sort of the wide players and the wingers. Obviously, I know I mentioned Foden and Grealish who could play out wide. But if we're looking at the other wingers, Raheem Sterling was named. This made his fourth tournament with England, and he was one of our most experienced players in the squad. He'd had well over 50 caps to his name at this point. And yeah, he'd been incredible for England in the build-up to the tournament. And he actually scored 11 goals in 16 games for his country before the opening game against Croatia. So he'd been an essential part of qualification. And he was great because the link-up between him and Harry Kane made England really dangerous going forward. But despite this, I remember there was quite a few people saying that Sterling should not start because his form did decrease just a little bit with City towards the end of the season. He wasn't scoring as many goals. He wasn't playing as well as he could before the tournament started. And I think a lot of people were like, well, it should be Grealish or Rashford who plays on that left wing. Now, all of those players are brilliant options, but Sterling was so important to the way England played. And even though other players in his position might have ended the season in better form for the clubs, Southgate still decided to pick him. I think that proved to be the right decision because, yeah, what a tournament it turned out to be for Raheem. Obviously, I mentioned Rashford and Sancho. Both of them did have good seasons. Rashford made it into double figures for both goals and assists for Man United, and Sancho had impressed at Dortmund in the Bundesliga. So both of them were good options. But the final winger, who I've not talked about yet, is Bukayo Saka. Now, Saka's inclusion was one of those selections that just excited you. Going into the tournament, he'd had a great season at Arsenal. And more importantly, he looked like a player who was at ease with international football from such a young age. Because we do see sometimes young players who almost get thrown in at the deep end for the country. For England, it can be hard, and a lot of them do struggle. But Saka just took it in his stride. And now, before the tournament began, he only made 5 appearances. And the first 4 came at left wing-back. But then in the warm-up game against Austria, Saka played as a right winger, which is obviously his more natural position. And he actually scored the winning goal. So he was a brilliant option to have. And it made perfect sense to have him included. But I think as much as you expected Saka to be in the squad, I don't think many people anticipated how much he'd contribute that tournament because, myself included, I thought he'd be one of those players who gets a few minutes here and there. But obviously, I'll talk more about Saka over the next few episodes, but what a tournament it turned out to be for him. And I think he surprised a lot of people. But you think about our attacking midfielders and wingers. I mean, the strength in depth was incredible. And it's not something that's often been the case in those positions. Going back to 2018, the World Cup, and England were almost forced to play with a back 3 or a back 5 because there was no one of real quality who could play out wide. Whereas 3 years down the line, you had Sterling, Sancho, Saka, Rashford, Grealish, Foden, who could all play on the wing. And it was really good to see such an abundance of talent and so many different options. And that's what's needed because in tournaments, you're going to need different players for different games, different opponents. So, yeah, it's great that there was so many options in attack. And the final position, which I've not yet covered, is the number 9. Obviously, Harry Kane. I don't think I need to say much about him. Obvious pick, guaranteed to start. And you always knew, you know what you're getting from Kane, don't you? Both on and off the pitch, a proper leader. But Kane's, I suppose, I don't know what the word is, understudy, deputy, however you want to word it. It was Dominic Calvert-Lewin, who was also picked. And this was his first major tournament for England at senior level. And it was fully deserved because he scored 15 goals in the Prem that season for Everton, which was really impressive, especially when in seasons before this, he was not getting anywhere near that number. So he had a great season. And also with Calvert-Lewin, he was a player who could hold the ball, link up play nicely. He was big and strong. A bit like Kane, obviously not at the same level, but it did feel like he was the best option to have. But obviously, you also had Rashford who could play as a number 9, as well as a few others. So that's why Southgate only took 2 natural number 9s, as opposed to 3. So yeah, that comes to the end of the squad, really. I mean, it's amazing to see the evolution of the squad from what it was like back in 2018. And obviously nothing against the 2018 squad members. They're all amazing. And played a huge part, but it's clear to see that in terms of talent and strength and depth, this squad was so much more exciting and had a lot more options, should we say. But I think the core of the team from that tournament sort of stayed, especially in defence. And that was huge because it allowed that continuity and familiarisation amongst the players as they had an understanding of each other. But England had built on the foundations that were laid back in 2018. But yeah, it's just, the squad is just so much better. Even like defensively, I know I've talked a lot about the attacking options being different, but even defensively, I mentioned like the left backs, but centre halves back in 2018, we had Phil Jones and Gary Cahill as our backup defenders. But now you've got Connor Cody and Tyrone Mings 3 years later, who were a lot younger, and you felt you could rely on them a bit more if there was an injury to Stones and Maguire. And that was obviously the case with Maguire in the first 2 games. But I do think all these young players coming through at the time was a lot of that was down to Gareth Southgate. He brought through a lot of these players and gave trust to them. People like Saka and Phillips. Southgate almost threw them in at the deep end, and he deserves credit for that. You know what I mean? And I know I've not covered each game in detail yet, but England had a clear identity that tournament, and that's why they did so well and got all the way to the final. But last thing I want to say about the squad, and I covered this quite a bit in the episode I did where I talked about COVID, bizarrely, but I mentioned how I actually thought it helped England when the tournament was delayed by a year, because I believe that it gave England more games and more time for some of these younger players I've talked about to come through. So I think that helped as well, because if the tournament was played in 2020 as originally planned, the squad would have still been good, but maybe not as strong as it was a year later. Obviously, I'm not saying COVID was a good thing at all, but if there is one positive to take from it, I do think England improved as a team. I mean, even people like Saka and Phillips, they might not have been in the squad in 2020, and they were 2 of our best players in this tournament. So I really do think there's something in that. But I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Like I say, it's strange because I'm almost giving my thoughts on the squad that was announced all these years ago. So it is a bit complicated sometimes to talk about. But I hope you enjoyed it, and I can't wait to be talking about another tournament again, though. I mean, as much as I enjoy talking about these Nations League games and qualifiers and friendlies, the tournament games is where the memories are really made, really. So yeah, really excited for that. But with this being our final episode of 2025, I just want to say a massive thanks to everyone who's listened to the podcast throughout the year, whether that's been one episode or every episode. Thank you, because honestly, I absolutely love producing these episodes. It really is so great for me, and it helps me a lot. It's a nice distraction at times. So yeah, recording these episodes really brought a lot of enjoyment to myself, and hopefully you've enjoyed listening and following the podcast over last year as well. So I hope you have a blessed Christmas, because I know everyone's circumstances at Christmas are different. It can be a tough time of year, but I hope you find time to rest and relax, and hope you have a peaceful next few weeks. Yes, and moving forward, starting 2026, I'll be talking about the Euros. The first episode will be the Croatia game at Wembley, so keep your eye out for that. And also, our Advent calendar will still be going up until Christmas Eve, the 24th. You can find all that on our socials. Okay then, thank you for listening to this episode and all the ones this year. Hugely appreciated. And until next year, take care of yourselves. God bless, and I'll speak to you in 2026.